The United Nations is launching an appeal for a record $51 billion in aid money for 2023. It estimates more than a third of a billion people will need humanitarian aid to get through next year. That represents more than 4% of the people on the planet, or about the entire population of the United States. Our chief correspondent, John Cookson, has the story.
Over 100 million people have been driven from their homes across the world as conflict and climate change fuel a humanitarian crisis. 9 months of war between Russia and Ukraine have disrupted food exports, and around 45 million people in 37 countries are currently facing starvation, according to the UN. The shortfall in funding for next year for the world's neediest isn't the fault of donor countries. It's more about the sheer scale of multiple crises to hit the planet at the same time.
The gap is because of the needs, not because of the funding. And the needs are going up because we've been smitten by the war in Ukraine, by COVID, by climate. And I fear that 2023 is going to be an acceleration of all those trends. And that's why we say in this report and generally that we hope 2023 will be a year of solidarity, just as 2022 has been a year of suffering.
Public health is under pressure due to COVID-19 and outbreaks of diseases like Ebola and cholera. Climate change is driving up risks and vulnerability, and by the end of the century, extreme heat could claim as many lives as cancer.
339 million people, a 25% increase of the total from 2022. 65 million people more next year than this year. And that increase is a steady increase in the last few years. Since 2019, if you look back at the trends, it's been going up steadily by about that amount. It's spiked with COVID, it went up. Unfortunately, it didn't come down after COVID, but the numbers have been steadily increasing. So the next year is going to be the biggest humanitarian program in the world.
For people on the brink, this UN appeal is a lifeline. For the international community, it's a strategy to make good on the pledge by rich nations to leave no one behind. John Cookson, Arise News.
All right, John Cookson joins us now from London for more. Good day, John. And let's get straight into it. The report from the UN says women and girls are most at risk. Now, we've seen so many initiatives, so much awareness being generated for the plight of women and children. Why is it that it's still projected that they are most at risk next year?
Well, I'm sorry to say the report concludes that in 2022, millions of women and girls are just treated as second-class citizens, and they just don't get a fair shout when it comes to their status in society and getting aid. The United Nations estimate 400 million women and girls throughout the world are in need of basic foodstuffs and are living in poverty, which is a terrible statistics. Countries, including those some in Africa, the Middle East, including Yemen, for example, and in Asia, especially in countries like Afghanistan, where women are treated like chattels. They don't get access to basic education and other things that men do. And this, of course, is under the regime of the Taliban. This whole report is absolutely shocking, coming as it does just a few weeks before Christmas, when people in the West, including those in the UK and myself, were about to spend much money on Christmas and festivities. And here we have this disturbing report saying that, in fact, 1 in 23 people in the world will need help in 2023. It's really a shocking statistic and a wake-up call. And these kind of news stories often get pushed to the side sometimes on the news agenda. And thank goodness the Arise News producer thinks that this, quite rightly, is a lead story today. The figures are just quite unbelievable.
Unbelievable is definitely an understatement. Now, John, what are the priorities as far as aid delivery?
It's basic stuff. It's blankets. It's food. It's COVID vaccines. It's shelter. It's tents. All of these things are desperately needed in countries, including now in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. I'm reading today Mykolaiv in the south of Ukraine, where I reported for Arise News earlier this year, 250,000 people there are effectively cut off from the outside world because of conflict, and they're in desperate need for basic foodstuffs and also power generators, which have been needed because of the Russian attacks on power plants. So there's been a shift this year in 2022 following the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February for need in Eastern Europe, where it's never been required before. So it's to answer your question, it's all the basic stuffs that ordinary folk need just to survive.
Now, of the $51.5 billion that is said to be needed, how much has been pledged so far in 2022?
So far, about $24 billion. The US, the biggest contributor, $14 billion they've put into the coffers. The least contributors have been China and India, giving only $10 million to the kitty. And it's going to be a squeeze for many Western nations to stump up the money that's needed. The UN is 40% there, so they still need to raise another 60% of the total of the 50 billion needed. Because so many countries, including the UK and Germany and the United States, are in recession right now. So there's already a squeeze on finances at home. So these countries are going to have to dig even deeper in the coming months. Whether that's politically viable, we'll have to wait and see. But to answer your question, the UN is about 40% there in all it needs to help the poor people next year.
Well, thank you so much for your analysis. Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, live from London.